Jasmine Crockett said, "Sit down, girl." Karoline's calm changed everything. The chamber wasn't quiet, not yet. It rustled with papers and murmurs, buzzed with electronic tension, whispered secrets through creaking wood and heavy breath. Phones flicked up like reflexes, as if compelled by an invisible force. A dozen reporters adjusted their ties, their camera lenses, their outrage presets, preparing for another chapter in the never-ending theater of American politics. The hearing was scheduled for 9:00 a.m., but it began unofficially unforgettably at 8:59, not with a gavel striking polished oak, but with a sentence thrown carelessly into the air. "Sit down, girl." Silence didn't follow. It detonated. The words weren't shouted. They were dropped like a match into a dry field, tossed lightly with the casual cruelty of someone confident in their status, confident that their insult would be absorbed by the fabric of tradition, by a room trained to flinch but not to fight. The cameras caught everything, they always do, but the story wasn't in the footage. The story was that Karoline Leavitt didn't blink. Not at first. She sat there composed and completely still, like marble chiseled into posture, as if the insult had not landed, but make no mistake it had. It had reached the walls of the chamber, had crawled up the oak paneling, had echoed through the rafters, and settled into the same pages of history that have recorded countless variations of that phrase, spoken by different mouths, but always carrying the same message. Know your place. Karoline Leavitt did not reply with words. She replied with composure, and that more than anything is what unsettled the room. On the official record, the hearing continued. On the live stream papers, shuffled voices resumed, topics shifted. But official records lie because beneath the resume of government protocol, the room had already changed. Technically, the committee convened to discuss judicial oversight. In practice, it had become a ballet of tension, an opera of posture, a silent referendum on who held the room's attention and why. Jasmine Crockett leaned back in her chair, unfazed, unbothered, perhaps unaware of how loud her silence had become. Her manicured nails tapped a pen against the table, not as a nervous tick, but as punctuation. She glanced at a chart on judicial misconduct, or perhaps only pretended to see it. Karoline Leavitt turned one page in her binder. The sound of paper folding over was louder than any rebuttal. She didn't look up. She didn't speak. Not until 47 minutes later. Not until a question delivered with the same tone that had birthed the insult floated across the microphone and gently dared her to exist. "Ms. Leavitt, any thoughts?" She placed her binder down her fingers, pausing just long enough to shift the air around them. She folded her hands deliberately, as if shaping stillness into sculpture. She looked at Jasmine not with anger, not with disdain, but with the disarming clarity of someone who knew her worth didn't require elevation. And then she asked 3 words. Words that weren't meant to sting, but to end. "Are you finished?" A laugh slipped out from someone seated in the back, quickly, nervously. Another person coughed to mask what was in truth the first crack in the room's composure. Jasmine didn't smile. Karoline didn't either, because this wasn't a joke. It was a timestamp. The exact second the temperature shifted. Not against Jasmine, not for Karoline, but toward something older, something sterner, something sacred, a new standard, a new stillness. Social media didn't wait for the transcript. Clips were online before the hearing officially adjourned. "Sit down, girl" trended across platforms, an indictment in all caps. But just below it, gathering strength, was a quieter anthem. She didn't flinch. Karoline Leavitt didn't hold a press conference, didn't draft a tweet, didn't send a spokesperson. She didn't need to. The room had already heard her, and it would not forget. That evening, Jasmine appeared on cable news. She laughed. She deflected. She rebranded her words as humor, a playful jab. She shrugged off consequence with practiced ease. "You know how these things go," she said, waving it off. "I was just playing." But the clip sharp, short, sacred kept playing. Looped. Reviewed. Archived. Not because of what she said, but because of what followed. A pause. A page turn. A stare. A question that wasn't meant to provoke, only to illuminate. In classrooms across the country, students replayed the moment, not for drama, but for dissection. In campaign offices, speechwriters discussed tone. In closed offices, women watched alone, fingers hovering over keyboards, as if the right words might finally appear. They weren't looking for a meme. They were studying a master class, in power that doesn't shout, in restraint that doesn't bend, in presence so still it becomes a mirror. Karoline never issued a public statement. She never identified herself as a victim. She did exactly what the moment required. She left room for the echo. And echoes, real echoes, don't fade. They deepen. They multiply. They remind. The morning after the hearing, America didn't wake up. It remained suspended, still caught in that question, those 3 words, and the look that didn't blink. The video had done more than go viral. It had become gospel. Karoline Leavitt didn't tweet, didn't thank her supporters, didn't comment on the coverage. She simply showed up to work on time in black, carrying the same binder with the same quiet spine. The press waited microphones out like bait. She passed them without pause, her heels echoing off the marble floor, louder than any headline. Across the country the reaction wasn't loud, it was layered. Some called it poise, others called it political jujitsu. But what they all agreed on, whether pundit or protester, was this: something had shifted. For Jasmine Crockett, the weight didn't land right away. She did what many do when confronted with backlash. She leaned into the noise. Retweets, defenses. She took it the wrong way. It wasn't that deep, but it was. It always is when the insult doesn't bounce. It embeds. And this one had rooted itself in the country's skin. At first the ripple was digital. Memes, hashtags, commentary from voices who never watched hearings before. But then came the speeches. Young women, high school debaters, law students, local council members began quoting Karoline's moment. Not to mock, to model. They used her name in new ways. As Karoline Leavitt showed us, dignity doesn't always require volume. Teachers paused lectures to discuss the moment. Ministers quoted it in Sunday service. One billboard in Michigan simply read, "She didn't flinch, now we don't either." Jasmine noticed. Not all at once, but in pieces. The room at her next fundraiser felt different, more polite, less fervent. The questions during press appearances changed from policy to perception. Do you regret your language? Was it gendered? Would you say it again? She answered the way trained officials do, smiling, reframing, redirecting. But the truth wasn't in the answers. It was in her eyes, and they had started blinking more. Karoline still hadn't said a word about the incident, but her silence had grown teeth. When approached by journalists in the Capitol corridor, she simply replied, "I'm here to work," and kept walking. No indignation, no righteousness, just purpose. And perhaps that's what unnerved the system the most. She wasn't performing. She wasn't reacting. She was redefining the stage. One afternoon, a journalist from The Atlantic asked to profile her. She declined, not because she was hiding, but because the echo didn't need a spotlight. It needed space, and the space widened. A documentary filmmaker began compiling moments like Karoline's women's silence, then seen. The working title, "She Stood." Karoline declined to participate. But the trailer featured her stillness like a refrain. At a public university in Georgia, the communications department used the hearing clip in its rhetoric curriculum. Students broke down body language, tone, and the power of the question, "Are you finished?" It wasn't what Karoline said. It was what she didn't say afterward. It was that she didn't chase the moment. She let the moment follow her. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett started noticing things. Phone calls returned slower. Interviews tighter. She wasn't canceled, not in the cartoonish sense social media often predicts, but she was recalibrated, and slowly internally she began to feel it. She drafted an apology, then deleted it, then redrafted it. Each version softer than the last, none quite sincere enough to satisfy her own reflection. Finally, she wrote it by hand. 3 paragraphs, no excuses, no spin, just regret, and she mailed it to Karoline's office in an unmarked envelope. No press release, no tweet. Karoline received it, read it, folded it. She didn't frame it. She didn't reply. She placed it in the back of her binder, next to her prepared remarks, next to her silence. They met again weeks later in a budget oversight meeting. No cameras, no press, no tension. Just 2 women sitting across from each other, with too much memory and too little need for vengeance. Jasmine nodded. Karoline nodded back. And that was all. No reconciliation speech. No performative hug, just mutual understanding, a treaty made of time. Outside that room, the world kept shifting. The viral moment didn't die, it matured. Artists began painting it, Karoline in grayscale, seated and serene. The words, "She didn't flinch," ghosted in the background. One mural appeared in Brooklyn, another in Phoenix. A spoken word poet included it in her national tour. She didn't fire back, she didn't break, she just waited for the room to hear itself. At a memorial for a civil rights leader, a student recited Karoline's words in a speech about quiet courage. Jasmine watched the clip online, and this time she didn't blink either. She didn't smile, she just listened, because sometimes growth doesn't announce itself. It listens, and then it walks forward. Karoline Leavitt kept the letter, not because she needed proof, not because she wanted closure, but because it reminded her of something that politics often strips away: what it means when someone admits they were wrong quietly, without audience or applause. She never spoke about the apology, not to staff, not to reporters, not even to herself. It sat in the back of her binder like a silent oath, folded between pages of legislation and handwritten notes, and yet it followed her. Every time she walked into a room, someone glanced differently, not because of fame, but because of weight. She had become a symbol not of retaliation, but of restraint. A figure people projected on not just admiration, but aspiration. She didn't command it, she absorbed it, gracefully, carefully, without asking. Jasmine Crockett carried the echo of her mistake, not like a burden, but like a compass. Every meeting felt subtly adjusted. Every conversation came with a mirror. She found herself pausing more, listening deeper, asking questions instead of delivering conclusions. It was change, not loud, not branded, just present. And sometimes present is enough. The first time they sat near each other again, close enough to hear breath paper, thought it was at a bipartisan ethics roundtable. No cameras, just folding chairs, coffee, and too many reminders of what politics used to be before it became performance art. Karoline arrived with her binder. Jasmine brought a single folder. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer icy. It was intentional, as if they were co-authoring something neither could finish alone. During the break, Jasmine walked to the hallway alone. Karoline followed, slowly. She stood beside her, eyes forward. "I read your letter," Karoline said finally. Jasmine didn't speak. She waited. "I didn't need it," Karoline continued, "but I kept it." Jasmine nodded. "I didn't write it for you," she replied. "I wrote it because I couldn't carry the silence anymore." Karoline smiled softly. "That's the only reason to write anything," she said. And then they went back inside. What came next wasn't reconciliation. It was realignment. They weren't allies. They weren't adversaries. They were something stranger, two women holding a single moment from different ends, stretching it across time and policy, trying to see what could be saved from it. The letter never made it into the record, but its fingerprints began showing up elsewhere. Karoline's speeches shifted: more questions, fewer accusations. Jasmine's tone adjusted, softer but not weaker. Her sentences breathed. On a cold March afternoon, both were scheduled to speak at a panel on institutional respect. Karoline went first. She stood, spoke, measured, deliberate. "No title gives us character," she said. "We build that between our mistakes and our restraint." Then she sat down. The applause was quiet, not because it wasn't felt, but because sometimes clapping would be too loud for the moment. Jasmine followed. She stood, exhaled. "When we weaponize language," she began, "we usually forget what it costs us when it lands wrong." She didn't mention Karoline. She didn't need to. The audience understood. Sometimes presence is the footnote. Sometimes silence is the citation. Weeks later, an aide found Karoline in her office, reading an old copy of the Constitution. "Not for politics, for poetry. There's a line in here," she said, lifting her eyes, "about respect. It's not written directly, but it's in the white space, the pauses, the commas." The aide smiled. "You gonna quote it?" Karoline shook her head. "No," she said, "I'm just gonna carry it." The letter was never scanned, never copied, never leaked, but it kept showing up in ways nobody could trace. In the pause before someone replied, in the tone of a town hall question, in the way two women who once stared through each other now nodded at the end of each session, like authors signing the same page, without needing to add more ink. The invitation came without warning, just a simple card tucked in a navy envelope, embossed with the seal of a National Civic Forum. No press release, no headline, just Karoline Leavitt's name printed beside the word keynote. She almost declined. She had grown used to walking quietly. Headlines had become shadows, not spotlights. But something about the stillness of that envelope, the way it wasn't about her, but about something beyond her, pulled her in. The forum was held in a public auditorium in Atlanta, an old building with deep red curtains and wooden floors that creaked like they remembered the weight of past reckonings. Karoline arrived alone. She carried no speech, just her binder and memory. The crowd was mixed: activists, veterans, journalists, students. Some came for the moment, others for the meaning. The moderator kept it simple. "Our next speaker didn't ask to be here," she said. She didn't chase the mic. She simply held the silence long enough for the rest of us to hear. Karoline walked up the steps. No music, just breath. She placed the binder on the podium, then paused. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't with force. It was with clarity. "I've been in a room where someone told me to sit down," she said. "And I didn't rise to correct them. I rose because the room needed to remember who was standing." There was no applause, not yet, only breath. "I came here without a speech," she continued, "because this isn't a performance, it's a reckoning." She looked out not to impress but to connect. "We talk a lot about civility," she said. "But what we need is conscience. We ask for unity, but we forget the cost of unspoken wounds." Then she did something no one expected. She stepped away from the podium, walked to the edge of the stage, and sat. Right there, legs crossed, eyes steady. "If we want to lead," she said from the floor, "then maybe we should learn how to sit with each other without assumption, without performance, without needing to win." The room didn't erupt. It leaned in. One by one people stood, not in applause, in acknowledgement. A student in the back whispered, "She's not speaking to us, she's speaking with us." And in that moment the forum changed. It wasn't a speech anymore. It was a gathering. Jasmine Crockett watched from the live stream. She hadn't been invited. She wasn't supposed to watch, but she did. She sat in her living room, alone, a cup of tea going cold beside her. And when Karoline sat down on that stage, Jasmine whispered to no one, "That's what I forgot." She didn't mean power. She meant presence. A week later, Jasmine appeared at a town hall in her district. The room was tense. Recent legislation had upset constituents, and the audience came ready for a fight. But Jasmine did something new. She started with a pause. She let the silence stretch. And then she said, "I've spoken at hundreds of these, but today I want to hear you first." And she meant it. She placed the microphone on a stool and stepped back. People lined up. They spoke. Not all were kind, some were harsh. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She nodded. She listened. She took notes. At the end, she didn't defend every policy. She just said, "I'm still learning, and I thank you for teaching." It wasn't a soundbite. It was a seed. In the months that followed, something odd began happening in committee rooms, on cable news, in university lectures. People stopped shouting. Not everywhere, not always, but enough to notice. Instead of one-upping, they started waiting. Instead of proving, they started processing. And in one session of Congress, someone invoked Karoline's line, "Let's not rise to speak over, let's rise to understand." It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. Karoline never mentioned the forum again, but people who were there carried it forward. A teacher in Milwaukee opened her history class each Monday by asking students, "What silence should we sit with this week?" A preacher in Alabama began pausing 3 full seconds after each sermon point. A podcast in Chicago created a series called "The Floor is Yours," giving victims of policy failure a space to speak uninterrupted. And a letter never published, never scanned, sat folded in Karoline's binder the whole time. Not as memory, but as promise. Because the crowd had listened, and the silence had spoken back. The resolution was barely a paragraph long, titled simply "Respect Clause, Draft Arrow 1. It was placed at the bottom of a thick policy stack under subcommittee notes and infrastructure charts. It sat quietly inked in simple font, unadorned by political buzzwords or dramatic titles. Just lines, measured, precise, intentionally calm. No one expected it to matter. Not at first. It wasn't a budget. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't even enforceable in any legislative sense. It had no fiscal note, no attached rider, no lobbying campaign whispering behind it. But it was a seed. And in halls built to echo power, seeds can shift foundations. Karoline didn't introduce it. She didn't even write it. But the words were unmistakably her. We believe that in governing language is not decoration, it is direction. And dignity is the threshold of policy. The staffer who penned it had watched Karoline sit on a stage in Atlanta and decided to write something that might outlast a moment. Something still, something serious. Within days, the resolution made its way up. Quietly, it didn't carry an endorsement. It carried gravity. It wasn't debated. Not yet. It lived on office printers and underlines, on email forwards, in whispered conversations between junior aides and interns, who for once saw something pass through a system not for show but for shift. People paused when they saw it, because something about the phrasing didn't feel political. It felt human. Jasmine Crockett heard about it from her chief of staff. Looks like they're moving on a respect clause, he said, standing in her office doorway, holding a manila folder with the clipped printout. She blinked. Wait, that was real. He nodded. They're calling it symbolic, but you know how these things work. Symbols leak. Jasmine sat back, folded her arms. She remembered the letter, the crowd, the moment the floor had been more powerful than the podium, and she knew, symbols don't just leak, they stain. And sometimes, if they're strong enough, they stay. By the following week, committees started discussing language formally. One senator asked, "Do we really need to police tone?" Karoline answered from across the table calm, "We're not policing tone, we're recognizing harm." Another member scoffed, "What's next?" penalizing sarcasm. Karoline didn't flinch. "No," she said. "We're just documenting the cost of it." That cost, she explained later, wasn't a fine or penalty. It was the erosion of trust, the cheapening of debate, the loss of moral posture in a room designed to hold the weight of law. Outside the hall, public interest grew. Editorials debated the clause. One op-ed read the respect clause, silencing debate or dignifying it. A rival outlet countered, "If you fear respectful speech, maybe you've forgotten what power is for." But underneath the noise, something else stirred. Young staffers began editing memos more carefully. Committee chairs adjusted the way they opened sessions. Interns started watching old hearings and asking why did they think that was okay. And when Jasmine stood to speak during one heated markup, she paused first, looked around, then said, "I support this clause. Not because I always lived by it, but because I learned from what happens when I don't." No applause, just stillness. That kind of honesty doesn't need clapping. It needs echo. One afternoon, Karoline entered an ethics review meeting to find a chair had been placed beside her seat. A plain chair, wooden. No one claimed it, but everyone understood. It was the same kind of chair that stayed empty in too many rooms. The same chair that had started this all. Karoline didn't sit in it. She just rested her hand on its back and began her testimony. The way we speak to each other is not decorum, it's direction. And if we keep steering anger into every sentence, don't be surprised when the country crashes. The room didn't shift because she yelled. It shifted because she didn't. Because she paused. Because she made them hear the weight between the words. Across town, students were already writing essays about it. Professors started quoting the clause in lectures on governance. And at a legal conference, a young clerk asked a panelist, "Do you think restraint is a policy or a performance?" The answer came quietly, "Depends who's watching, depends what you're carrying." When the clause passed in the committee unanimously, it didn't spark a celebration. It sparked a recalibration, a new way to begin. Press briefings started with more care. Colleagues nodded before they spoke. And when disagreements came, and they did, they came with less theater, more thinking. It didn't fix the system, but it cracked a door. And in places long sealed by cynicism, a crack is a revolution. The amendment reached the House floor. It passed again. Then it reached the Senate. The floor debates were quiet, measured. Senators quoted Karoline without naming her. One said, "We cannot legislate morality, but we can legislate reflection." Another, "This clause doesn't muzzle passion. It asks it to be principled." The official title was later changed to the Respect and Responsibility Amendment, but everyone called it what it was, the Karoline Clause. She never called it that. She just kept her binder closed, the letter still inside, and let the room breathe. Because sometimes the most powerful change begins not in roar, but in rewrite. In the months that followed the passage of the Respect and Responsibility Amendment, the building stayed the same. The columns of Congress still cast long shadows at noon. The chambers still echoed with shoe leather and gavel strikes and the hum of history. But something subtle had changed. It wasn't on the schedule. It wasn't in the headlines. It was in the pause before speech, the glance before interruption, the decision, however brief, to listen before answering. Karoline Leavitt didn't claim that as victory. She wouldn't even call it progress. She called it responsibility. Because leadership, she once told a group of high schoolers visiting the Capitol, isn't about being heard. It's about making space so others feel they can speak. They asked for selfies. She obliged. But it was clear her mind was elsewhere. Already on the next briefing, the next oversight review, the next paper clipped into her binder. She remained a figure not of performance, but of posture, of stillness so purposeful it shook systems. Jasmine Crockett changed too, not into a replica of Karoline. She remained vibrant, direct, sharp-edged, but her sharpness had softened. The jokes, when they came, landed with care. The rebuttals, when delivered, bore thought. She no longer filled every silence. Sometimes she waited, and when a younger colleague once turned to her after a hearing and whispered, "I was about to snap," Jasmine replied, "Pause. It's harder, but it lands longer." She never erased what she had said that day, but she built from it, layered new habits over old impulses, brick by brick, tone by tone. Meanwhile, Karoline's quiet momentum grew. She didn't run for higher office. She declined op-eds. She refused offers to tell her side on cable specials. Her story had already been told. Not in a book, not in a film, but in the way people around her began behaving. Capitol staff created a new onboarding module, Ethics of Language and Public Service. It quoted Karoline indirectly, included transcripts of the moment she sat still, called her a case study in restraint, and no one disputed it. She kept her desk simple. No plaques, just one framed photo of her family, and beneath it, folded neatly into her binder, was the letter, still, uncreased, unreplied to, but deeply present, not as artifact, as anchor, because it reminded her not where the story ended, but where it turned. Outside Capitol walls, Karoline became something different. Not a celebrity, not a saint, but a signal. To activists, she was proof that dignity still functions under pressure. To students, she became a thesis. To journalists, a bar, not because of her volume, but because she had never once reached for the microphone that day. It had found her, and she had made it listen. She gave a speech at a small community college in Ohio, unannounced, unpaid. No live stream, just folding chairs and late autumn wind. She opened with a story about her grandmother who once said, "You know, a tree's strong, not by the way it sways, but by how much it doesn't move in a storm." She looked at the students, young, tired, curious. "Be that tree," she said. Then she closed her notes and took questions. Most of them weren't political. They were human. "Do you ever regret not clapping back when asked?" Karoline smiled. "I don't live with regret," she said. "I live with the room that silence created." Back in Washington, the Karoline Clause had become precedent. It didn't control what people said. It simply asked them to own it. One senator called it a moral speed bump. One student called it a civic lullaby. But Karoline didn't call it anything. She kept showing up. Binder, jacket, clarity. And when a freshman representative misstepped during a heated debate, words flung too far too fast, it wasn't Karoline who corrected her. It was Jasmine. She waited for the clip to settle, then walked to the Congresswoman's office, closed the door, and said, "Want to write a letter?" The young woman blinked, then nodded. Jasmine handed her a pen. "It matters," she said, "even if only to you. Legacy is not what you leave in your name. It's what people do after the room quiets." Karoline understood that. And as she sat in her office dusk, bending through blinds, she reached for her binder, opened it, looked at the letter again, still crisp, still silent. She didn't need to unfold it. She already knew the words, and that knowing that weight carried without parade was enough. Because Karoline wasn't standing for attention. She was standing for continuity, for conduct, for every moment after the moment where history stops watching and character begins. Still standing, always,